So if you're like most of us, when you think about food, your mind probably jumps to flavor or maybe the cost, right?
Or sustainability, that's a big one now. Yeah.
Exactly. But there's this whole invisible world and infrastructure that makes every single meal safe. And December, well, that's the month for it, Worldwide Food Service Safety Month.
And that infrastructure is really our focus today, this deep dive. It's kind of a dual exploration. We're looking at the very modern, super science-based approach to food safety.
So regulations, cold chain logistics, all that.
Right. And then we're looking at a much older spiritual foundation that, and this is the wild part, it actually sets up the exact same priorities for purity.
We looked at some source material for this.
Yeah.
Well, it offers a really unique perspective. It frames food safety not just as, a chore or some regulation you have to follow, but as a core part of ethical excellence, maybe most surprisingly, at a fundamental requirement for real, meaningful charity.
Yeah, so our mission here is to unpack the history of Worldwide Food Service Safety Month, connect it to this 1,400-year-old Islamic concept of tayyib.
Which means wholesomeness.
Wholesomeness, purity, goodness, yeah. And then we'll show how the highest ideals of that ancient idea are being enforced today using, 21st century logistics, everything from strict protocols to blockchain.
Wow, okay. That's a powerful mix, merging ancient wisdom with modern tech to make sure safety is, well, a universal standard. So let's start with the modern foundation. This December observance, Worldwide Food Service Safety Month, or WFSSM. It's actually pretty recent, isn't it?
It is, yeah, that's right. The primary research we looked at, it shows the initiative was set up in 1994.
94, okay.
By the National Restaurant Association Educational Foundation. And the purpose was really practical, very clear-cut. Get people more aware of food safety education and, well, work aggressively to stop foodborne illnesses.
I think we kind of forget how big a deal foodborne illness was even just a few decades back before this kind of standardized training was everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
It makes perfect sense an industry group would lead this. But what's really interesting is how it evolved. It started as a national project, but it became a global thing.
It had to, really, because the problem itself is global. Food safety, that responsibility is shared by nature. It can't just be handled by big regulated companies.
Right.
It starts with the big producers, sure, but it goes all the way down the line to the small farmer and, the person cooking for a community meal. WFSSM is that annual nudge, that reminder that everyone has a part to play.
And big in December. That feels very deliberate. It's not exactly a slow month for food service.
No, it was a very intentional, strategic choice. According to the materials we saw, the founders picked December specifically because it is the busiest time of the year for food.
All the gatherings, holiday meals.
Exactly. Communal meals are at their absolute peak. So it's an effort to influence what we do during that holiday rush to make sure a celebration doesn't accidentally become, a public health problem.
That context really grounds why we need these modern protocols. But if 1994 is our modern starting point, our sources suggest the principles themselves go back way, way further.
Yeah.
Let's pivot to that, this legacy that predates microbiology.
For sure. For many people, the whole idea of food safety is deeply tied into faith, into ethical conduct, going back more than 1,400 years. And this is where we find that concept of tayyib.
Which he said translates to something like purity or goodness.
Purity, goodness, wholesomeness. Yeah, it's a really comprehensive principle. It governs everything from, say, where you source your food to how you prepare it and eat it.
So we're talking about a systematic hygiene standard that existed long before we even had microscopes to see what a germ was. What did that actually look like? How do they handle threats they couldn't see?
Well, the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah, it emphasized these very specific hygienic practices that were, in effect, public health measures. It was a framework of behavior to minimize contamination.
Okay, like what?
Think about something as simple as hand washing. The tradition wasn't just about washing your hands before a meal, which is just common sense.
Right.
It was also about washing hands after the meal.
Oh, that's fascinating, that dual action. Because washing after, that stops you from passing on anything you might have picked up from a shared dish or touching your face, right?
Exactly. You pass it on to the next thing you do or the next person you meet. It's a very, very robust barrier method.
Yeah, it went beyond just personal hygiene.
Yeah, much further. There were strict practical rules on keeping water sources clean. And water, that's a primary way diseases spread then and now.
And what about the food itself? The sources mentioned meat handling and preservation.
Yeah, the focus was making sure food was not only permissible to eat, but also ethically and hygienically prepared. So this included really specific, clean methods for animal slaughter and, immediate proper handling of the meat. The core idea is that what you eat has to contribute to your well-being, both physical and spiritual. It has to be tayyib.
This really clarifies that distinction you made at the start. This tradition, it goes so far beyond our modern idea of just like regulatory compliance.
Right.
It's not about checking a box to avoid a fine. It's about embracing a spiritual standard of excellence. You're aiming for purity because it's just the right way to act.
That's the crucial insight. It just elevates the entire standard. When you see safety through the lens of tayyib, it becomes an essential part of dignity and quality. You're not motivated by fear of punishment. You're motivated by ethical integrity.
So if we shift back and look at the evolution of food safety from just a scientific perspective, we see this huge change, right? Moving away from those ancient common sense practices to something incredibly technical.
A dramatic shift.
We went from the simple and honestly super unreliable sight and smell tests,
I'm hoping you could see the spoilage.
right, to these rigorous science-based methods.
And that transition really happened in the early 20th century. That was the turning point, when science finally proved that the real culprits making people sick were invisible. Microbial contamination, exactly. And that understanding led directly to creating regulatory bodies and data-driven protocols.
And the global bedrock for all of that today is HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control points. We hear the term a lot, but what does it actually involve?
In short, HACCP is all about prevention. So instead of just checking the final product and, hoping it's safe,
Right.
you identify every single step in the food process, from the farm to your fork, where a contamination hazard could happen. And for each of those spots, you set up what's called a critical control point, a CCP.
So CCP might be, for example, the minimum cooking temperature for chicken,
Yeah.
or the maximum time something can be kept in that temperature danger zone.
Precisely. And if that control point is missed, if the temperature drops or the time runs out, you have a problem and that product gets pulled. It's a system that's really designed for a stable, professional setting with reliable infrastructure.
But that's the big challenge for today, right? For 2025 and beyond. The world keeps throwing these huge curveballs at those protocols. HACCP was designed for stability, but we live in an unstable world.
And according to the research, there are two major forces straining that system to its limit. First is climate change. Extreme heat puts a huge strain on cold chain logistics, even in developed countries.
And in places without reliable power.
Forget about it. Spoilage becomes far more likely, far less predictable. A CCP that relies on refrigeration is useless if the power is out for 12 hours.
And what's the second pressure?
Global instability and conflict. Supply chains just get completely disrupted, inspection systems collapse, and with the constant movement of people and goods under stress, tracking and maintaining food purity is just incredibly difficult.
So if this highly technical, rigorous system starts to break down under all that pressure, what are the ethical implications? Especially for aid organizations.
And that's where the principles of tayyib become so critical again. I mean, if safety is already hard to manage in stable, developed places, the complexity of doing it in a conflict zone, it's immense.
And yet the moral demand for purity for tayyib doesn't change.
It's non-negotiable.
Let's connect this directly to the idea of sadaqah, or Islamic charity. The sources make a really strong point here. Charity isn't just about the quantity of food, filling a plate. It has to follow that Quranic principle of tayyib too.
It creates this powerful mandate for dignity. I mean, the context we studied is pretty sobering. In places like remote villages or crowded urban slums, the lack of clean water and proper food storage leads to just catastrophic levels of preventable sickness.
So a family in a terrible situation shouldn't have to worry that the aid that's supposed to save them might actually make their kids sick.
Exactly. The act of giving aid has to be coupled with these rigorous professional safety standards to make sure the charity itself doesn't cause harm. And that requires a complex chain of care. It's way more than just delivering bags of rice. We're talking about investing in high-quality ingredients, hygiene education for aid workers and the community, secure cold chain logistics, all of it.
It's one thing to say you're following HACCP in some sterile, modern facility. It's a completely different challenge to implement those same rules in a community kitchen set up in the field,
Uh-huh.
maybe in extreme heat with, barely any utility.
And that's where contributions make a real difference. They're used specifically to build these kitchens that follow adapted HACCP guidelines. This makes sure food is handled, cooked, and stored at the right temperatures, even when you're dealing with dust, heat, or unreliable resources. It's about building a system where safety is a right, not some luxury.
This sounds like a perfect place where technology can step in and bridge that gap between the ancient mandate for purity and the modern logistical mess. And this is where our sources brought up something really interesting: blockchain.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how that philosophy of purity gets enforced by digital tracking. Think about what Tayyib demands. It requires total ethical conduct and trustworthiness. If you track food on a normal spreadsheet, anyone with access could potentially change the record.
Right, which creates a trust problem.
But the innovative use of blockchain, it provides this auditable, transparent, and basically tamper-proof digital ledger. So you can track the freshness and safety of supplies, the record of where the food came from, how it was handled, its temperature. It's all permanent and visible to everyone.
That level of transparency and accountability is exactly what the principle of Tayyib is asking for.
Precisely.
So for you listening, this means that when people contribute funds to something like this, they're actually funding the infrastructure of trust and dignity.
Yeah.
The sources make a really compelling case. Choosing to support aid using tech like this is basically a vote for professional, safe, and dignified aid. It connects their digital wealth directly to physical health.
It closes the loop. It shows how a 1,400-year-old ideal of purity is now being sustained by 21st century finance and logistics. The specific details in the sources, selecting an asset, scanning a code, giving through a secure portal, that's all just the modern way of carrying out an ancient ethical mandate.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the founding of WFSSM in 1994 as a response to modern health needs. We went deep into the principles of Tayyib and prophetic traditions that define safety as a matter of, of spiritual excellence.
And we watched that historical shift from just looking and smelling to rigorous science formalized by HACCP.
Then we saw that same commitment to purity applied directly to global aid, where that rigor is now enforced by innovative tech like blockchain to ensure transparency and uphold dignity, even under the most extreme pressure.
It really shows that the commitment to safety is this unbroken thread through human history. It doesn't matter what the technology looks like. It's a core commitment to the well-being of other people.
It really is.
And as we think about all this deep historical and logistical context, especially during Food Service Safety Month, our sources really leave us with a choice to think about. We can either act now to professionalize food distribution everywhere, or we can just continue to let preventable sickness caused by unsafe handling hold back the growth of our youth.
In considering the high standards we've explored, both ancient and modern, it raises a big question for you. If we demand these professional scientific standards for the food you eat every day in a stable place, shouldn't we demand the same, or maybe even more, for people whose only source of food is humanitarian aid? That choice for safety. It's really a choice for the future health of our entire global community.